Just to talk about some of the recent changes, really, really major changes that have happened in the world of genetics, particularly since we mapped the human genome, which has opened up a whole new domain of science, which is called epigenetics, which literally means over and above genetics. Epigenetics started to come into existence in the 1950s and 60s, but now it's flourished enormously as a result of mapping the human genome, because there were a good number of surprises in mapping the human genome that nobody had. Some scientists had predicted some of them, but once they had mapped it, they really got some big surprises. And the biggest surprise, of course, was that most of the genome most of the DNA in the human genome does not code for proteins. The old assumption, the core assumption was that DNA codes for proteins, which then provide the building blocks of life one way or another, with enzymes functioning on them. And it was what became clear was that this was not the case, that only, I think it's about 1.8%, they now agree, or maybe a bit more than that, actually code for proteins to produce the building blocks of life. And the rest, for a long time, for an intervening number of years, was labeled as junk DNA because nobody knew what it was all about. And a very large amount of it is old viral material and old material that they don't understand. But they do now understand that the RNA, because DNA is transformed to RNA and then to proteins, and they do understand that the RNA, much of that, functions as building blocks in a way that hadn't been understood before. It doesn't code directly for proteins, but they become building blocks of our body structure. And it also controls things like cell death and all sorts of very complicated stuff, which I find very interesting, but it does get to be pretty complicated. Some of the fun things that they discovered are that our genomes they thought we would have 100,000. We're now in an era that is known as the time of epigenetics. In other words, epigenetics, the term epigenetics means over and above the genome. And the reason we have shifted towards this direction is because of the mapping of the human genome, which proved to be considerably different from how we had thought it was going to be. And it became clear very quickly that only about 1.8% of the human DNA actually codes for RNA and produces proteins. And the rest of the material, they had no idea what it was doing, and they called it junk DNA, and there have been whole books written called junk DNA. And gradually, they're beginning to understand some of this, and some of it does turn out to be old viral material from infections that have been transmitted down, but they're no longer infections, it's just dead, inert material that was originally DNA-type material. And the way in which we now understand the genome is entirely different from prior to its mapping. First of all, we discovered that the human genome is much smaller than we thought it was, and the length of our genome is about the same size as the experimental tapeworm that they work on, called C. elegans, has about the same amount of active DNA as we do. And it's also the case that the genome, they have realized very, very clearly now, is in fact acted upon by the environment in a way which hadn't been understood. The assumption had been that our genes determine who we are, and that is not the case. So this is a profound undoing of what was common knowledge. And what has been shown to be the case is that the DNA, which is actually inert material, surprisingly, is acted upon by the environment from the moment of conception on. Environments both inside the body and external to the body. And that and there's an intermediate force, a material called chromatin. So the whole thing is all folded up on itself in a very complex and rather beautiful way when you look at it in electron microscopy and so on. What this means is that it is now clear to a very large number of scientists that we have to pay much more attention to environments if we're to understand health and illness, and that we haven't been doing that adequately at all. Of course, there are many, many basic geneticists who continue mapping genomes of various kinds and trying to figure out. They have a long, long way to go figuring out the function of what various parts of DNA do and where. There's a huge amount of work to do. But this other area called epigenetics, and the scientists are epigeneticists, are now working on environmental matters and how this affects human development through individual human development and lifelong development. So one major area is actual development from conception to adult life, the differentiation of our organs, because we start out with cells. As an embryo, it starts out with cells which are called pluripotent cells. In other words, these cells can become anything. They have the potential to become anything. And the big question was, for years and years, how do they become a heart rather than a liver, or how do they become nerve cells rather than stem cells, and so on. And all of this is done through environmental effects on the developing embryo, internal to the body, but also it can be external to the body. So there's now a very large literature which shows long-lasting, unfortunate events that can take place to embryos in utero from external environments, i.e. poisoning of one kind or another imbibed through the mother. Alcohol we know about causes trouble, but we now know that many other things cause trouble too, and that the embryo is extremely sensitive to the uterine environment. And so there's been a spotlight on the health of mothers, pregnant mothers, and a lot of epigeneticists have been doing research which limits their findings to the relationship between pregnant women and the uterus and the fetus. And the anthropologists come along and are very concerned, because what is forgotten is that this pregnant woman is often living in an environment which is a traumatic one or very non-congenial. It could be violence, it could be extreme poverty, it could be having to be a refugee and travel and constant migration, all of these different things. Most of the epigeneticists acknowledge these larger issues as crucial, but they cannot do their laboratory research if they pay attention to this. So they focus down on the mother infant dyad, or the mother and her uterus, her fetus, and they focus down on this. And they're very interested in tracking the actual molecular changes. So what they are doing, which is terribly important, is that instead of demonstrating just associations between poverty and ill health, which of course the epidemiologists have done forever, and many social anthropologists do this kind of thing too, those demonstrations have been made for a long time. But now they're beginning, the epigeneticists are beginning to track the actual molecular changes that are taking place, which means that these kind of associations are now becoming very, very hard data, which are going to have effects in court cases and in assessing who is responsible for ill health. And it is possible, we'll get to the point reasonably quickly, if social scientists become involved, of course having to consider the pollution in the environment and the toxic environments, and not label fault at individuals. That it has to be, the responsibility has to be legally made clear as being much, much larger than what's going on in families. So this is a very important advancement. It also is the case that we now know from some of the research that these epigeneticists have been doing, they know some of the changes that happen to the genes because of pollution of one kind or another, or stress of one kind or another. And a process called methylation takes place, blocking the activity of certain genes. This is all early days, and there's lots of arguments, but there's some very good research that's been done. And in animal work, there is intergenerational transmission of some of these epigenetic changes. So far, it hasn't been demonstrated conclusively for humans, although some scientists believe indeed that that is the case. That when a hard, tough lifestyle seems to appear in generation after generation, and ill health seems to keep going in a certain family, that it may not just simply be a lack of willpower, or it could actually be that this is being driven at the very deepest molecular level through cell memories. So this opens up a whole new way of thinking about the relationships of humans to their environment and who is responsible for what. And as I say, we're at early days, but it's a very, very exciting time. And of course, it makes one rethink the story of the First Nations. It's incredibly important to pay attention to the whole historical process of colonization and the continued racism and discrimination, and the continued poverty, and the grassy narrows mercury rate, and that kind of stuff is all things that needs to go into this picture. And should hopefully lead to a much better politicization of these problems, rather than turning it back and re-embedding it as a kind of racist kind of failure argument. And there are other examples from totally different, everywhere in the world, but Romanian orphans from the Ceausescu regime, where a very, very large number of children ended up in orphanages in Romania. And one of the studies, an American team came with money and fostered a lot of these orphans out into families, and then tracked the development of these orphans, those who'd been fostered and those who were left in the orphanage. And the orphans and then they were able to actually do some neuroimaging as well. And it was very clear that if you could get those kids out of the orphanage, where there was only about 6 helpers for 100 children or something awful like that, if you could get them out of the orphanage and into a foster family, that their brain development was very different, and that they wouldn't lose much by having been orphaned if they were fostered in a good family, and the brain would develop, in quotes, normally. Whereas those left to language in the orphanage, their brain development was damaged as a result of being there permanently. So there are studies that are beginning to show these kinds of dramatic differences. The most obvious ones are to do with toxicity, and which of course everybody knew about. They knew about lead and they knew about mercury and all these toxic metals. But now they are able to actually document that and follow through on what happens. And in animals, it's certainly intergenerationally transmitted, these changes. Some of these epigenetic changes are reversed very quickly, and others are not, and they don't know why yet. They have an awfully long way to go. But what it's done is to open up the environment as being of huge importance, which is why I believe anthropologists have got to unblack box the body rather rapidly and start paying attention to this, because the epigeneticists themselves always want to miniaturize the environment so that they can control their laboratory experiments. And anthropologists can come along without being hampered by that, and can look at the larger picture and at the whole history and create ethnographic accounts and historically informed ethnographic accounts with information from local peoples about why their lives don't seem to be working or what has happened. And complement the epigenetic findings, which badly need to be situated in a bigger picture than we're getting at the moment. And so we're now living in an era called an era of the reactive genome. So genes are no longer the driving force. The DNA is busy reacting to environments, internal and external to the body. And it's a remarkable time for anthropologists to really step in and think that there's tons and tons of fantastic research that we could probably contribute to in this area. So one of the relatively recent books, I think it was 2010 when this one first came out, is a co-authored book. This is not edited, this is a co-authored book with my past student, Vinh Kim Nguyen, who's an MD, PhD. And it's called An Anthropology of Biomedicine, and it's another of these huge tomes, as you can see. And we're busy creating a second edition of this right now because it sold incredibly well and it needs to be updated very urgently, and this includes a lot more of these new things to do with epigenetics that I was telling you about, but also a lot of other new material on globalization and health and the changes in new technologies getting to other places, all parts of the world, and changing healthcare and how it falters in so many parts of the world despite the new technology. So this one is, again, this is another book that's in parts, and it deals with technologies and bodies in context. It deals with what's called the development of the idea of a normal body in biomedicine. It deals with anthropologies of medicine, i.e. what anthropologists, the ethnographies and so on that have contributed to this. It deals with local biologies, and it deals with colonial disease and biological commensurability, moral boundaries, human transformations, and organ transplants, kinship, infertility, assisted reproduction, genomics, epigenomics, human difference revisited, and so on. So it's a big, solid book, which will be out again for the in the next fall, in the fall of 2017. And I think we're getting to the end here. The book that I have done, co-authored book most recently, is called Can Science Solve the Nature-Nurture Debate? And it's written with Gisli Palsson, who's an Icelandic anthropologist. I was called up by Polity Press that published this book to ask if I would be interested in writing this book. And at first I thought no, and then I thought, well, if I don't do it, I thought of all the people who might do it who wouldn't do a good job. And so I finally said yes, and I asked Gisli to join me, and they make you keep it short and succinct, and so that really helped making the decision, right? And this is an incredible press that really has amazing editors and has very strict limits to what you can and can't do. So it makes the job a little easier in some ways. And at first I said to them, look, that's going to be a very short book, because the answer to this book is yes and no. And so we then had to go away and think, well, how do we deal with this? And the answer really is yes and no, but under all sorts of circumstances and contexts and with changing knowledge, and we deal with epigenetics in here too, and the way in which nurture is being reinterpreted and rethought about. But what we emphasize in this book more than anything else is the entanglement of both nature and nurture. And it's not just simply genes and environment. It's a really deep entanglement of biology and the social, cultural, historical, and that part of the future work for anthropologists is to really think through how to express this kind of embodiment, not in either ors. Because that's a false dichotomy right there, and one has to really, it demands that we think of new ways of writing about this material. I think we are at a big, important transitional moment in an anthropology of medicine, or an anthropology actually of the biosciences, in thinking through the question of embodiment and the complexities that we now realize are implicated. History, more than ever, is something that's truly important, and I don't think that we can do decent work without having a really strong historical component in just about any project that we take on. And of course now, as I mentioned earlier, we are in the age of the Anthropocene, so we are busy messing up the environment. We humans are messing up the environment, or certain of us humans are messing up the environment beyond belief. And if capitalism goes ahead without any controls at all, and we're approaching a future that it's pretty hard to envision how it could work out in a reasonably appropriate way. It's a traumatic time, I think, and I think anthropologists really have a job to, they should be joining in on this and making their views clear about this. And I recently had to give a major lecture in England, the 2016 Thomas Huxley lecture for the Royal Anthropological Institute in the British Museum, which was really very, very exciting. But I started this clarion call for anthropologists who I think we've done an incredible amount of fantastic work, and the new ethnographies that are coming out are just so remarkable. They're not just in medical anthropology, they're across the board, incredible ethnographies coming out. But we tend as anthropologists to hide our light under a bushel, and we're not out there in the public domain enough. And people don't know what we've been saying. And so often we go to lectures and we sit there and we think, my goodness, we said that 20 years ago. And I think anthropologists have got to make themselves more public. That's, I think, something that is incredibly important for us to do. from now on.